My guest at this time is John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent and White House Correspondent at Newsmax.com. He joins me today to reflect on the passing of two notable names in Congress. Former Democratic Michigan Congressman John Dingell served nearly 60 years in the House, longer than any other member of Congress in history. North Carolina Republican Walter Jones passed away as well after more than 24 years in office. He was first elected in the 1994 Republican Revolution. And John, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Greg. A pleasure to talk to you, and especially a pleasure about talking to these two individuals whose death is a loss to me professionally and personally.
Well, let's start with Congressman Dingell. You were able to attend his funeral in Washington on Thursday. Dingell did not just mark time in Washington over those 59-plus years. He was a very powerful man during many of those years because for the first 40 years, Democrats had the majority. What do you see as his greatest legacy?
Obviously, his greatest legacy is the preservation of the American car industry. It's funny, when he got married in 1981 to Deborah Inslee, who was an heiress to the Fisher Body family and also head of General Motors' foundation. People said he was now being bought by the car industry. And John Dingell gave a big hearty laugh and said, I was in love with the auto industry before I was in love with my wife. He protected the industry. Dearborn was the hub of his constituency, and there were a lot of auto workers there. And every major piece of legislation dealing with automobiles during his time in Congress had either his fingerprints or his personal copyright on it. And that includes, of course, the auto bailout for two of the three major auto companies under the Obama administration. I might add, somebody tweeted to me when the news came out Congressman Dingell died, he would have blown a gasket over the Green New Deal. Indeed, he would have.
John, many members of Congress are passionate about various issues, and Congressman Dingell certainly was about the auto industry and others, as we can discuss here. But it's another thing to actually be effective on working on those issues. Once he became the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, that certainly helped. But it wasn't just that. Why was he so effective at getting what he wanted?
He was effective because for all of his bluster, and he could be very intimidating simply to look at. 6'3" tall, 280 pounds, wielding the gavel in hearings as if he were going to use it as a weapon, and always having the style of the former prosecutor that he once was in Wayne County back in the 1950s. Witnesses were frequently put under oath. He would ask, is that your final answer? And one thought they were getting a full-blown interrogation. He read, he got the facts, he dug. But for all of that, he was someone who reached across the aisle. Congressman Fred Upton, Republican from Michigan, and the most recent Republican chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee to step down, recalled at the funeral service how he would see John Dingell across the hall and say, how are you? And he would say, better now that you're here. And that was a greeting to many that was just disarming. He dined with members. He would do everything from admonish Speaker John Boehner to quit smoking to sitting down with some in the cafeteria of the House and working out differences. He often said that the Congress he grew up in, under his father, John Dingell Sr., who held the seat 20 years before, was a place where people put aside their partisan views to be patriots and finally worked out something they could deal with.
John, you mentioned a moment ago that he would have blown a gasket had he seen the Green New Deal. Was he a vanishing breed of Democrat? He was pro-gun. I believe he was, at least in some ways, pro-life. He was pro-auto industry. The Democratic Party that's emerging right now seems to be certainly anti-gun and very pro-choice, and feels like moving more away from organized labor than and more towards some other ideas of politics. So is he a vanishing breed?
In many ways, he is. You have to remember this. John Dingell was the son of a congressman who worked as a congressional page, in fact, graduated from the page school. One of his great thrills was when his father introduced him to FDR, and he got to sit on the president's desk in the Oval Office. FDR was his hero, and that spoke volumes about him. His issues were civil rights, were the auto industry, as you say, were making America better. He was a great believer in the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and of course, in Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act, which the president dedicated him to when he signed it, because he recalled how it was John Dingell Sr. was the first member of Congress to introduce national health insurance before his colleagues. You are correct. He was not only a gun owner, but a member of the board of the NRA for many years. He was a Cold Warrior, basically. Remember, this is the grandson of Polish immigrants who spoke the Polish language. So he had family members under communism, and he hated it. And he was pro-life to a degree beyond virtually any Democrat in the House. I looked this up. The National Abortion Rights Action League rated him a mediocre 30%. That's pretty good for any Democrat today. I'd have to say he is a vanishing breed, because that kind of Democrat usually goes down in a primary. It didn't happen to this particular Democrat, well, because he was John Dingell, who took care of the folks at home. One final word about John Dingell. Civil rights was a great passion of his, as it was for his father. He was calling for an end to lynching and an end to segregation from almost the day he came to Congress. He voted for the Civil Rights Act proudly in 1964. And interestingly, redistricting threw him in with the congressman from the neighboring district, John Legacies Jr., son of a congressman and also a former congressional page and of Polish heritage. John Legacies Jr. voted against the Civil Rights Act. John Dingell voted for it. He also voted for the Voting Rights Act and felt that the controversial New York Representative Adam Clayton Powell should be seated in Congress, despite some problems he was having with ethics. These issues came out. They were debated up and down the district, and John Dingell did not run from his vote on civil rights, did not try to excuse it. He wore it like an Olympic gold medal. And even when black voters were cut out of the district in big numbers, he won by 5,000 votes.
Let's talk about another congressman who left us at the end last weekend, and that's Walter Jones of North Carolina, first elected, as I said earlier, in 1994. You knew him very well. You wrote a piece in tribute to him this week in Newsmax. You called him the gentle dissenter, someone with that old-school ability to disagree without being disagreeable. Talk about your personal relationship with him and why you think he stood out on Capitol Hill.
First of all, I met Walter Jones when he had just switched from Democrat to Republican. He and Mark Rotterman, his political consultant, came to my office to say, the son of the legendary Congressman Walter Jones Sr., chairman of the House Merchant Marine Committee, a pillar of Democratic politics in the Tar Heel state, was becoming a Republican. And in running for a district that included a lot of his dad's old turf in 1994, he unseated the incumbent Congressman Martin Lancaster. I always liked him because he felt he trusted me and a few other reporters. And when you had his trust, he would call himself, not through a press secretary, not through a spokesman, not with a press release or an email first, but an old-fashioned call, and he would offer me information. As I noted in the article, he saw me one day at the White House when President Obama hosted the Afghani president, Hamid Karzai, And I got back to my office, and there was Walter's familiar drawl. Why didn't you ask that crook Karzai about the millions he's spending in taxpayers' dollars to hook people on cocaine? That was Walter Jones right then and there. He was conservative across the board on every issue, from guns to abortion to marriage. And you knew it. He supported the tax cuts that were in the Bush package. He supported smaller government and had a lot of libertarian in him. Now, while initially supporting the U.S. strike in Iraq in 2003, he began to read extensively and talk to people in the intelligence field. And he concluded, rightly or wrongly, that George W. Bush had flawed information and yet wanted the U.S. to go to war to finish off Saddam Hussein. He said so and gave a series of interviews, beginning with a publication called Mother Jones. But he had changed his view completely and explained why. I might add that as courtly as he was to people on the opposite side, as much of a gentleman as he was to everyone he saw, this caused an estrangement with him and President George W. Bush. They never spoke again. Similarly, he felt that going into Afghanistan was a mistake. Many Republicans, nonetheless, while opposed to the U.S. going after Saddam Hussein, felt that going into Afghanistan was a pivotal part in the war on terror. Walter Jones concluded otherwise. In later years, he felt that the time had passed when we could cut tax cuts. The deficit and the national debt were reaching the trillions, and thus he broke with President Trump on the tax cut that was passed last year. I could name you many things that he did that sometimes drove me crazy, that irritated other conservatives to the point that he faced a primary challenge in 5 of his last 6 trips to the polls. But he was someone, whether you agreed with him or not, you knew he was sincere. One final point. Walter Jones talked to me often about how he grew up in a home where faith was there, but it was not strong, and how in military school he became a Roman Catholic, and it gave him such inner peace and strength. And every time he would cast a vote that he knew he would take abuse for, and he knew would create controversy, he said his prayers and he thought of his faith, and that gave him the strength to go on. I might add that when he converted to Catholicism, it was past the time that the post-conciliar changes, something still causing controversy in the Catholic Church, came in. He never really understood what a Latin Mass was or went to one, and he went to a vernacular Mass his entire life. I still like to tease him, and I would say Dominus Vobiscum, which is Latin for the Lord be with you. And he would always reply, yeah, whatever you say. That was Walter Jones right then and there.
John, thank you so much for looking back at these 2 very important figures on Capitol Hill over the last several decades. Thank you again for your time today, too.
My pleasure. Call anytime, old friend.
Thank you, sir. John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent and White House Correspondent at Newsmax.com. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.